Number 3. Karen Snider. In the autumn of 1966, 23-year-old Paul Snider and his 18-year-old wife, Karen, lived in Calumet City, Illinois. The couple had a 2.5-month-old daughter, Paula. Paul was an electrician at the Indiana Harbor Belt Railroad in Hammond, Indiana. On November 12, 1966, Paul was working the afternoon shift. Karen was home with the baby. Paul's parents lived a few houses down. They had been on vacation in Buffalo, New York for the past 2 weeks. Paul and Karen had been taking care of their dog. Paul's parents returned home that evening around 8:30 and unpacked the car. They called the couple's home, but no one answered. Then they walked over to the young couple's house to get the dog. They knocked on the front and back doors, but there was no answer. The house was dark except for a bathroom light. The TV was also on in the living room. When no one came to the doors, they entered the garage where the dog was chained up. They took the dog home. Paul arrived home around 11:10 p.m. He used the key and unlocked the front door. Upon entering the dark house, he noticed the TV in the living room was on. He went into the bathroom where the light was still on. He found blood stains. He called out to Karen, but got no response. He went upstairs and noted that the hallway light didn't work. He made his way to the main bedroom, which was also dark. He tried to turn on the bedside lamp, but the lamp wasn't on the bedside table. Then his foot touched something on the floor. He went and grabbed a flashlight. When he entered the bedroom with a flashlight, he found a scene from a gory horror movie. His wife, 18-year-old Karen Snider, was dead on the floor. What his foot touched was his wife's dead body. It looked like she had been shot in the chest with a shotgun. Blood was splattered throughout the room. There was a TV in the room, and it had been toppled over. The vanity had also been knocked over, and the mirror was broken. The phone had been pulled out of the wall, and it was broken. Paul called the police and his parents. His parents rushed over, and his mother saw the gore in the bedroom. She would not allow her husband to see it. The baby was found in a bassinet in the living room. She was unharmed. The police who examined the body also thought Karen Snider had died from a shotgun blast to the chest, but the medical examiner determined she had been stabbed to death. She had been stabbed 90 times in the chest, 17 times in the neck, and 19 times in the back, for a total of 126 stab wounds. The weapon, which was never found, was slim, like an ice pick or a screwdriver. Karen's blouse was torn and her skirt was pulled up towards her waist, but her underwear was undisturbed. It did not appear that she was sexually assaulted. The police looked around the home. A basement storm window was broken. There was a shard of glass with blood on it, but the hole in the window was not big enough for someone to climb through. Also, the window behind the storm window was unbroken and locked. The police did not think that the killer got through a window. There were also pry marks on the back door. Once again, the police did not believe that this was the point of entry for the killer because the door was still locked. The police believed that the killer entered and exited through the front door because there was a blood trail leading to the door. The police thought that the killer tried to make it look like they broke in to throw them off. They thought it was more likely that Karen let the killer into her house, which suggested she knew the killer. But the police were baffled as to why someone would want to hurt the young wife and mother. Her husband, Paul, had an airtight alibi because he was at work. While Karen had not been sexually assaulted, the police did not rule out the possibility that it was a sex crime. Days after the murder, Karen's funeral was held. Some detectives attended the funeral. One man caught their attention. He was a family friend and co-worker of Paul, 21-year-old James Barbier. He was one of the pallbearers. The police noticed him because he had cuts on his hands. Based on the blood trail and the blood on the broken glass, the police were sure that the killer cut himself during the frenzied attack. The police talked to Barbier's wife. She said that when he came home on the day of the murder, he was nervous. He also had fresh cuts on his hands. There was blood on his body and his clothes. He immediately put his clothes in the washing machine. The police arrested Barbier and collected the pants he was wearing on the day of the murder. Even though they had been washed, there were blood stains on them. However, the district attorney did not believe that there was enough evidence to convict him, so Barbier was released without being charged. After that, the case went cold. Paul and Karen's daughter, Paula, first heard that her mother was murdered when she was 5. Children at school talked about the murder because their parents had talked about it. Her father first told her about the murder when she was 11. Paul and his family were convinced that James Barbier was the killer, but they had no way to prove it. In April 1989, Paul Snider died at age 45. Decades later, in December 2022, a 29-year-old man named Paul Seeley called the police tip line. He said that growing up, his grandmother talked about the murder of Karen Snider. He had heard the story at least 5 times. He called the tip line to ask if there had been any updates in the case. After the phone call, detectives decided to reopen the case. It turned out that Karen's dress and James Barbier's pants were still in evidence. The police decided to track down Barbier. He was 78 and living in Creve Coeur, Missouri. They obtained a warrant for Barbier's DNA in March 2023, and they collected a sample from him. Testing determined that it was Barbier's blood on Karen's dress and her blood was on his pants. In April 2024, 79-year-old James Barbier was arrested at his home and transported to Illinois. After his hearing, he was allowed to go home because of the Pretrial Fairness Act. The Pretrial Fairness Act requires the court to consider a defendant's age and medical conditions when deciding bail. Barbier had a stroke the year before and he had diabetes. So he was allowed to go home, but he had to stay in Missouri or Illinois. He also had to surrender his passport and firearms. Karen Snider's family was disappointed that he got to go home, but they were happy that after 57 years, an arrest had finally been made in her murder. No trial date has been set for James Barbier. Number 2. Ross Grayam. In April 1968, Hiram Grayam, who went by Ross, was 47 years old and lived in Vero Beach, Florida. Ross served in World War II and participated in the Battle of the Bulge. He was awarded the Purple Heart. In 1968, he was married and had 3 children. In Vero Beach, he worked as a milkman. On April 11, 1968, Ross set off in his truck to do his milk route. At the end of the day, he did not return the truck to the depot. He also did not go home. His worried family reported him missing. The next day, police searches were conducted. A small plane flew over a wooded area and they spotted Ross's milk truck. The police went to the area and found his dead body lying next to the truck. He had been shot 3 times, execution style, with a small caliber gun. Ross's wallet was empty. It's believed he had been robbed of $70. Counting for inflation, that's about $630 in 2024. A witness reported seeing Ross talk to 2 black men who were walking on the side of the road. Ross then announced that he was going to return shortly. The 2 men got into his truck and they drove away. Another witness who lived close to the wooded area said that they heard gunshots. Then she saw 2 black men get into a late 1950s model Cadillac. The police believe that the two men forced Ross to drive to the wooded area. They robbed him and then executed him. No arrests were made in the aftermath of the murder. 3 years later, Ross's wife died, leaving their 3 teenage children parentless. Their oldest child, Larry, said she died of a broken heart. Over the next 6 years, there were 16 investigations into the murder, but still no arrests were made. For decades, the case was cold. In 2006, Ross Graham's family asked the Sheriff's Department to reopen the case, and they agreed. In October 2006, the Indian River Press-Journal published a story about the case being reopened. 2 of Ross's children, Larry and Karen, were interviewed. They both said that the murder was devastating to them. In the article, the police said they had 2 persons of interest in the case. After the story was published, the newspaper editor received an odd letter. It was from a man named Thomas J. Williams. He wrote that he had been accused of the murder, but he was not involved. The letter was odd because Williams had never been a person of interest in the case. He did have a criminal record. After he sent the letter, the police investigated him. However, no progress was made in the investigation. In 2016, Thomas Williams died. Then in February 2022, an inmate contacted the Sheriff's Department. He said that he was a friend of Williams' sister. He said that Williams had confessed to him that he had shot Ross. After hearing this, the police tracked down Williams' ex-wife. She also said that Williams had confessed to her. The 2 independent witnesses gave similar stories. The police believed the stories because the 2 witnesses did not know each other. They were both afraid to come forward sooner because they feared Williams. But since he was dead, they felt freer to talk. In April 2024, 56 years after the murder of Ross Graham, the police announced that Thomas Williams was the shooter. However, the case was not closed. 2 men were involved in the robbery and murder. The police believe that they know who the second person is, but they are unable to connect him to the crime. The police hope that someone with knowledge of the person's involvement in the crime will come forward so that they can finally close the case. Number 1. Shawna Garber. On December 2, 1990, a couple was looking for cans on a rural road in McDonald County, Missouri. They were about 4 miles north of Pineville. Near an abandoned house, they found the badly decomposed body of a woman. She had been hogtied with 6 different types of bindings. It was determined that she had been strangled and overdosed on methamphetamine. It's believed that she was dead for 1 to 2 months. This would have put her death in September or October. The woman had no identification on her. The area was searched and no identification was found. She did not match any local missing persons reports. She was described as a white woman between the ages of 21 and 31, about 120 pounds, and she had dark collar-length hair. The description was made public, but no one came forward to identify the woman. One piece of evidence the police did investigate was one of the bindings, a parachute cord. The cord wasn't commercially available and was only used by the military. But this did not lead to any arrests, nor did it help identify the woman. 19 years later, in 2009, the skeletal remains were sent to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. A facial reconstruction was done and a DNA profile was created. But again, it did not lead to the woman being identified. One of the detectives said she would only be identified by the grace of God. This led to her being nicknamed Graystow. In September 2020, Orthram Incorporated, a private DNA lab, contacted the Sheriff's Department. The skeletal remains were sent to Orthram and a new DNA profile was created. Then they did genetic genealogy. It led them to a woman named Danielle Pixler who lived in Topeka, Kansas. They contacted Pixler, and she said she had a half-sister she never knew. When she was 3 months old and her half-sister was 3 years old, they were put into foster care. They were placed in foster care after their mother tried to set her half-sister on fire. Pixler said she had been looking for her half-sister since she was 18. But over the past 28 years, she found nothing. She agreed to give Othram a DNA sample. They compared her DNA to Grace Doe's DNA. It confirmed that was her half-missing sister, Shawna Beth Garber. The authorities could not find any photos of Garber as an adult. Garber was born on March 1, 1968, which means she was 22 when she was murdered. Garber had spent most of her life in the foster care system in Kansas. She was adopted, but then returned to foster care after a short time. She stayed in the system until she was 18. Garber had an older brother, Rob Ringwald, who also spent decades looking for her. He was devastated to find out that her remains had just been sitting in a box for almost 30 years. Her family arranged to have her remains buried next to her great-nephew. The police then set to work trying to solve the murder. The police learned that after Garber got out of foster care, she went to Oklahoma to find family. At the time of the murder, Garber was living in the Pineville area, living in a halfway house. In August 2023, the police announced that they had a prime suspect in the case. It was Dennis Rader, the notorious serial killer known as BTK. When he became the suspect, he was serving 10 consecutive life sentences for 10 murders he committed between 1974 and 1991. Rader had bound his victims, which was part of his nickname. BTK stood for bind, torture, kill. Also, Garber was killed months before Rader killed his 10th victim, which is believed to have been his final victim. With that final victim, he murdered her in her home and then dumped the body elsewhere. But there were problems with Rader being the killer. All of Rader's victims were killed in the Wichita, Kansas area. Garber's body was found in a different state, about 225 miles from downtown Wichita. Also, Rader didn't use drugs to kill any of his victims. Finally, when Rader was caught, he was very forthcoming about the 10 murders he was convicted of. Why would Rader not talk about Garber's murder when he had already confessed to 10 murders and was going to spend the rest of his life in prison? Rader's daughter, Carrie Rawson, cooperated with the investigation. But the detectives eventually ruled out Rader as a suspect. Then they focused on a longtime suspect, Telfie Reeves of Pineville. Reeves was 24 years old at the time of the murder. Reeves had a long criminal record and he was involved in drug trafficking. In 2004, the sheriff received a letter that began, "I want to tell you something Telfie Reeves did." The writer then detailed the murder of Shawna Garber. However, even with the letter, the police were unable to make progress in the case. Nevertheless, the detectives were confident that Reeves was the killer. One of the detectives, Lori Howard, confronted Reeves about the murder. She told him that just before he died, she wanted his last phone call to be to her, and she wanted him to tell her about the murder of Grace Doe. Reeves supposedly stared at her and smiled. On November 15, 2021, Telfie Reeves was riding his scooter on US 71 near Jane, Missouri. He was doing a U-turn and a car slammed into him. 58-year-old Reeves was killed. He died a little over 7 months after Shawna Garber was identified. After Reeves died, people felt freer to talk about Reeves and the murder. The detectives talked to 6 people who gave them information about Reeves' involvement in the murder. One person said she heard everything Reeves did, and then saw everything he did. Another witness said she saw the body several days after the murder. Based on the witnesses' accounts, the detectives pieced together what they believed happened. When Garber was killed, she was living in a halfway house and working at a chicken plant. It's believed that she was walking along Missouri 59 on Halloween night and Reeves picked her up. He was driving an old pickup truck that he had borrowed. He tied her up using material he found in the truck. He brought her to the abandoned house where he raped her. Garber kept screaming, and this made Reeves worried. They were in a valley, and her screams echoed. He thought that someone might hear her, so he injected her with methamphetamine to keep her quiet. This led to her overdosing. He also strangled her. In March 2024, nearly 34 years after the murder, the police said that they had enough evidence that if Telfie Reeves were still alive, they would charge him with first-degree murder. Detective Lori Howard said, quote, "We are 100% certain we got the guy. What breaks my heart is that he's not alive. I know he has family and people who love him, but he should have had to pay for what he did. Maybe he is, I don't know. But we do have the right guy," unquote. Rob Ringwald, Garber's brother, said, quote, "I guess karma got him, you know. I prefer to see him in prison, but you reap what you sow. I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's poetic justice. He ended up getting killed himself." Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now, and there's a link in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.